All right. Well, I mean, I don't know. How should we begin? There's
Let's
there's
just jump in. Let's just jump in.
jump in.
But let me read what you have here first.
Okay.
What stood out in reading or being one or being the other woman?
I love calling it or. That's perfect.
No, the way you use or throughout this volume is incredible to me because it's contradictions, it's supplanting the subject with something else. It's this amazing way that or functions throughout the book. But I'll get to that in a moment and in different ways. I felt as a like in speaking about this thing of critical thinking and concerns about, but the economy of words towards and to remain tightly bound, not only to your experience, but the way that you have experienced things and the difficulties in finding words for things or finding in the moment. Yes, we can all reflect after through analysis and also and find words and kind of, which is a very exterior way of reclaiming one's experience. And I think even in my own work, but I see this very much how I feel about the structure is that you want to remain very close to that experience and how that experience kind of unfolded in a way. And therefore, all of the contradiction and confusion or lacking of words or difficulty in comprehending and at the same time understanding what's happening is important for the person who's reading. It does not all come, you try to keep very close to that experience. And I find that, to me, that is one of the most difficult things to remain in with regard to memory and with regard to witnessing one's own experience of being able to relay it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the gift of these monographs too. I had a lot of fun looking, but one of the things that seems settled about the critical response to your work is this idea that it's about memory. You say it sometimes, but as like words don't always make sense to me. I say this a lot, that when people think that I'm supposed to understand what a word means, and I'm like, I have no idea what it means. I'm sorry, I can't respond. So memory, for me, it is so it's a contested word, right? It's a word that we actually don't know the meaning of. And so when you said just now, that's what the practice of trying to be devoted to a practice that is about unsheathing memory or something like that. It's about trying to stay close to an experience and like unsheathing it, like taking it out, re-examining it, seeing how, because it isn't static, right? It's not a thing that happened. It's experience is like a global, physical, temporal, universal experience. And so what aspect of that can you show? Because it certainly can't be shown in words, right? Like it not really. So,
but that's the beautiful difficulty though.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, I think in terms of thinking about, even in terms of the work, that would be the impetus that would kind of, that would make it in a very flat way. Oh, that's very interesting. I always remain that what made it interesting was my difficulty in the moment, not my revelation years later.
Yeah.
So, and did you just, and also you were saying the word marriage. And as I was kind of reading this, but also thinking about a conversation that was had at a kind of Thanksgiving table when I was maybe maybe 25, 26. And it was my mother, my father, girlfriend of mine, her new husband, and me for Thanksgiving. And there was always tension between my grandmother and my mother for various reasons. There was tension between me and my dad. But and this is the beauty of having friends at what is, the dysfunction of the way one's family is, that my girlfriend asked just very casually, like, oh, pass the sweet potatoes, and then said to my grandmother, so Madeline, why have you never remarried?
Mm.
And my grandmother was a person who could talk about Chicago politics in terms of the United States and even globally, and history, but would never really talk about her personal life.
Mm-hmm.
So it rendered my family side of the table silent. Like I was like, oh, I didn't ask that.
What's she going to say?
Right? And my grandmother sat there and then sat back in her seat and said, I don't want to have to kill nobody. That's what marriage meant to her.
Oh my God.
So even being a young woman and kind of seeing all these, relationships, mother and child, father and daughter, grandmother and granddaughter, like familial relationships, husband and wife, and the kind of complexity of all those things, that kind of set a kind of thing in me. It ain't all what you think it is.
Right.
And it is the system that I would have to rail against, is basically how I took that. And then said nothing else.
That was it. There was no more conversation.
Well, I didn't have the courage to go to like interrogate that further. So, as a grown woman now, and like having bits and pieces of seeing the way women in my family navigated or made decisions, it really was against all kinds of norms.
Right.
And so then, I mean, with regard to that, in this kind of what marriage means, but how it occupies and shifts and changes people, I find to be somewhat, I mean, maybe some people have great relationships, but at the same time, it seems to demand that someone be in control of all identities.
Right. Yeah.
That I have always found to be outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
Either one gives up their identity in service to another person or to an idea, and that in many ways there's a loss of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just my
I love the autonomy word is a good one, and one that I'm feeling like way more comfortable with than freedom right now. Yeah. But it's funny because when I think about what I was trying to do or whatever in this book, or I wasn't thinking. I mean, this is the thing about like critical practice and art practice. Like there wasn't a moment where I was thinking that I had like a theoretical intervention on my own behalf to make in this book. But certainly it starts with the question of what marriage is, like what a wife is. It's not inside me, that question, but it does. It's like the first question of the book, probably.
Right. Yeah.
And so, like in retrospect, I guess that is really, what the book is about. Yeah.
It is, but it also seems to be about one's mind, one's body, one's autonomy in the sense of, like you're saying, of being ill and still having to work, like this machine of capitalism of which marriage is very much a part of. And right. So your product, your work, your sense of protection, your sense of being a mother and taking care of a child and making sure that they're safe means also that you need to be safe. All these things that I guess is one's interior life. And yes, marriage is the kind of outer layer, but it's also this interiority that you are talking about from many different aspects. And quite interestingly, that music and trap music, and let me just turn to I mean, the different artists like Ray Simerod, I'm not saying his name right, Swiley, Gunna, like all these different artists that you also talk about their exteriority
Mhm.
in terms of the performance.
Yep.
Right? And so there's this dichotomy between the interior life that is supposed to remain quiet, almost silent, experienced, under threat, but that there seems to be some aspect of assumption that your interiority should never become an exteriority.
Right. And that there's a kind of lack of available performances too, right? For what is actually inside me or inside maybe other Black women too, that there's the sort of available models of being normal. I mean, I had another conversation recently about the question of like whether or not the book is in fact about being odd or something. And I mean, it's so interesting, Lorna, because in your work, one of the things that I'm interested in is, I don't know how to put it. There's a way in which, especially in your earlier work, there's a kind of peaceful resolution of not only the words that are presented in the works, but also the gestures and the bodies in the work. They seem to float to me. And there's something that shakes me up about that their sense of being at rest in the moment that you give them, or something like that. And that seems to me to be a pretty extraordinary thing to do for the representation of a Black woman, to give her a place to be, and to not have that place be a place of just complete disjunction with what she has been offered. And so to leave a certain kind of openness, right? And just like, I don't know, just to there's a generosity to it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And a kind of just smartness, kind of like deep.
Well, I mean, I kind of feel like I had to afford that for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think in anything, in kind of any kind of creative practice, there are many ways to move through it. But I do feel like, the exteriority of the way that I'm perceived from the outside, and particularly, I guess, during 80s and 90s, of kind of a certain amount of visibility in the kind of all the negative kinds of ways, but also invisibility.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to the art world. Like I would go to a dinner and I would like, oh, hi, who are you? Oh, are you here with, him?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know him.
I don't even know that.
I'm just here with me. How about that? So just, my sense of myself, but always had felt, the implications of the world around me in terms of my personhood out in the world, but also besides that, and a complete interiority of my own world, of my own making, that there would always be this disjunction between like being interviewed about my work and as though I weren't a Black person as pictured in the work. So there's this kind of hypothetical question that's thrown at me, like, well, if you, in being a Black woman, what if? And I was like, but I am. So
right. Yeah, like
there's this weird disjunction in terms of the reception to that work during that time that I think only proved the thing over and over again, the importance for interiority, whether it is understood or not, whether or not any reader of it comes to a full comprehension of what they're reading in a way that they are congratulated for understanding is unnecessary to me.
Right. I mean, it's interesting to think about the question of the audience for your work as it's been over the, I mean, how many is it
90 million years.
40 years, 40 years of public work, and talking about the ways in which there was in some ways no public vocabulary for talking about your existence in the art world or your work. At least on white people's part, right? The sort of art establishment. Because when, now we sort of think we have a framework for talking about experimental Black artists and experimental Black art. What's your perspective on the sort of, I don't know, the sort of regularization of Black experimentation or abstraction or something like that? You know what I mean? Like the ways in which it has come to the fore, and the art world, I think, does think it knows how to talk about us. And we think we know how to talk about ourselves.
Right.
Mm.
I mean, I would say to have a sense that any kind of boundary or any kind of ism has been fully understood, particularly you're talking about maybe African-American life or imagination, is a kind of, is ridiculous to me. But at the same time, I think sometimes what I experience is a lot of rehashing of things that have already been written about and mined through the 80s and 90s, that sometimes appears in writings as like, oh, I've got this great idea. And it's like, yeah, have you read? Yeah, that's true. But I think, the kind of rigor that is great work, that is good writing, survives. And so I'm not so concerned in a way, in terms of the temporal, keeping track temporally of all these kind of ebbs and flows within the art world, because from my experience, it's like what matters or what kind of has a staying quality. I'm not even talking about my own work at all, but in terms of writers, it remains. And it will remain so as a touchstone. And that to me is the thing that's more interesting, because the art world is also kind of flamboyant in its, parties and and isms, and it's very temporal and short-lived or short-sighted very often in that. So I kind of stick to what speaks to me.
Can I, they might take this away from the final conversation, but can you, like, who gets you? Who gets your work, do you think? Like what?
Oh, I mean, tons of friends of mine get my work. Let's see. I mean, who gets my work? No, the book in terms of Fiden is filled with
a great book.
All that I have enlisted, whom I trust, who they trust me, and I give space to also. Like, I'm not dogmatic in that kind of way. I do give space for them to kind of think about ideas, and there are within certain volumes conflicting ideas, even within that, which is fine, and I think is important, because it's also about time and an evolution of time, in terms of the way that we think about things, but also how we are also transformed over the course of time. And so I hope to allow for that.
I don't mean to like have an academic conversation, but I do, just because you raised it just now, that the Beckwith piece at the end that sort of tries to take account of the later work. I was really, just curious, because I hadn't really seen anybody write about that development in your work yet. I've been, I told you this, off this recording, but the new work, it really struck me, like it kind of fell on me like a kind of ton of bricks, kind of. And I just and it's not that the sort of the visual language had, is like nothing I had encountered before. Like I think Wangechi Mutu is working in a similar sort of on non-planetary way.
Or surreal.
The surreal and but I don't know how to describe it. There's a kind of it was a new language for me, that I you know, I'm very excited about, that there's a kind of sadness too, I think, that I
Mm,
really connected with. And I don't know whether that sadness has to do with the, you know, the engagement with the planet to a certain degree, right? But and I'm not, you know, like, climate is not at the forefront, to be honest, of my own physical work. But I don't know. I love that in some ways I can sort of be like, I don't know anything about painting, right? Like I'm
yeah,
free, I'm free to just connect with the
yeah.
things that I connect with.
As one should, yeah.
And I connected with those things. And I told you that I was in your studio as one of those paintings was being made. And I just happened to be in there because of Erica Hunt and Don Lundy Martin's
Yeah.
book party.
Yes.
And I just sort of stood there.
I mean, I think as I think of my work, and like, and part of what you were saying is like, this realization for you, like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And,
Mhm.
but I do feel it's like we are so controlled about who we're supposed to become, what we're
Mhm.
supposed to be, and one's interiority to kind of really protect, not protect in a way that there can't be any incursion from the outside world, but that it gets to live fully. And I just feel like my work, I've always have this respect for, if it comes into my mind and it's really there, then I have to do it, whether I know how to do it or not, whether or not it makes sense, whether or not like, okay, so what's that about? I don't know, but keep going.
Yeah, I don't know how to do
I,
it yet. Yeah.
eh, but you do, because even I think it's a thing of like, when I kind of read through, or being the other one, that I was saying also the word or, there's this way that you're talking about interiority and exteriority, of protection of that, of the value of that, of pushing back at, oh, so you don't think that my interiority matters, so
Mm.
therefore that will not be the subject of my work. I think particularly as a Black woman, there's so much censorship and control
Yeah.
over what one wants to say, or over the descriptives of one's life, over the texture. And I just feel so like part of, I think what you see is my willingness, or I very much abide by, that is what is important. And
Mm.
it doesn't always have to make complete sense to me, and the work can go in completely different directions. But what I find challenging is the thing that you're like, so I'm just getting to this now, is the thing like, I don't know. Like, so I can make these paintings, or starting a practice of doing collages, or starting a practice of doing drawings, and not know where it's going, or not, even after having the show in Los Angeles last summer, this time, I could
Mhm.
not talk about the work. Because I had been through too much in terms of the pandemic. A whole range of things happened during
Mhm.
the pandemic. Some amazing, beautiful, magical, great. Some, really hard. And making work through that period was just like, I don't have words for what this is.
Yeah. You're
But
talking
I
about the
know
stacked
that
work
it's my
now.
interiority is speaking. And at
Mhm.
this point, that's going to have to be okay.
Right.
Um,
The stacks pieces.
yes.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, so, you know, just kind of like thinking about how, whether there's like a language, a critical language that I mean, obviously I'm very involved in thinking about how Black studies develops and what kind of
Mm,
words we use to talk about the existence of Black people and
yeah.
philosophical problems. But in a way, you know, I think the art part of me is always in struggle with, exactly as you say, that there is a lag between, you know, what's inside you, right? That what's inside you, and therefore as an artist, has to be worked on. You have to work on it. There isn't really another way. But there really isn't any language to describe that particular configuration because it's inside you.
Right.
And so, there isn't, and I feel this really, maybe in a dumb way, like I
You
feel
are
dumb
dumb.
about it.
Yeah, you had me until you said dumb. Now I'm like, what?
I'm dumbfounded by it. Maybe I
Okay,
could say that. Or
okay.
like,
Yeah.
I often am, I'm surprised so often by the fact that I have no words for what I experience, for what I see in others' work.
Mhm.
I don't know why those cubes in your stacks are so evocative for me. I don't know.
Right.
And I see their presence in other, fields
Mhm.
in your work or something like that. But that's not why I find them moving. In a
Mhm.
way, they look more like teardrops to me than,
Mhm.
whatever blocks of ice or something like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And um the struggle, right, between this sort of the inside and the outside, for
Mhm.
me, is both a philosophical struggle
Mhm.
and one that has to do with like the official apparatus of like academia and the art world, how they are always struggling to kind of celebrate, the solution of something.
Right.
And it's
Right.
like,
And
I,
and and thus it's nailed into a coffin,
yeah,
only to be excavated and then readdressed later by someone else when
yeah,
it's that tight. I mean, I kind of feel like that is the best part of not having the words, and or through experience, or when I would say situations or people or things that are said to me that don't fall the right way, or I go like, okay, this is turning into a nightmare. Or clearly we're not on the same page and this person is saying some bullshit that's just, God. Is interesting because what first occurs for me is like, I don't have a word for that, or
Mhm.
I don't understand it.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that sense of that is another part of oneself that has an inquiry into,
Mhm. Mhm.
that is open, that is kind of shielding the kind of rote response, is
Mhm.
shielding or keeping out, like you were saying, all these critical things about capitalism and the way that we live in the kind of onslaught
Yeah.
um, of supremacy and all of that. That voice, like, I don't have a word for that, is saying, I can't use your system of words. I
Yeah.
have to invent something else.
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard. And it also leaves one kind of not, for me, I'm trying to think of the feeling that I get when I have that. Not displaced. It's kind of grounded, but everything is swirling around me. But I think it is a kind of maybe Black subconscious thing of like, okay, I know the toolkit of the words that I use is part of the fucking problem, and I
Yeah.
can't use that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love so the word that I sometimes use is vortex or something like that to
Mhm.
describe that feeling, that there's exactly a displacement. The ground is not under you anymore. And that's actually why I get interested in trap music too, because it makes me
Right,
feel that way.
right,
Um, because of the interior exterior sort of
right.
like foreground in the music maybe, but
I
also
mean,
it's loud, it's noisy, right?
there was one which you do in kind of the way that the book goes back and forth in terms of music, but there was one, I'm trying, where is it? Oh, it's like page 13. And so you have a quote from a lyric from Gunna, and it's got me a real mistress, and she independent,
Yeah.
which I was like, okay, down with that. But also that Gunna is kind of embroiled in the controversy of rap lyrics as being admissible in court,
Yes, he is.
right? And so
Mhm.
it's two things that are going on in that quotation for
Mhm.
me.
Mhm.
The author, and again, what is the cost of one's interiority or
Yes,
artistic practice?
yes.
Um, and thus is a reflection of what is going on here. What is the stakes of you and your interiority as an artist and the way that you write? It's like pointing, I feel like there are all these layers that you are pointing to in the way that this is laid out. But there's also, which also then in that same vein, you write, my lover writes to me, we use an encrypted form of digital messaging as if anyone cares. So I just thought like the juxtaposition of all these things, of this interiority, and that either the protection of it from what threat, real threats, imaginary threats, domestic threat, was one that on this particular page really was like beautifully layered to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny. I'm very interested in this, what's happening. Gunna I don't know that he's been released from prison. But I'm really interested in that sort of the evidentiary problem that you're mentioning, that rap lyrics have been, used as evidence in criminal trials. And, that's a separate conversation that one day I'd like to have on paper, but
as a lawyer, yes.
But also the RICO prosecutions of various folks, those are really, really problematic legal problems that I hope somebody is going to be turning their attention to. But the ways in which we, it's like, what's out there? What's the sort of symbolic universe that we can draw from that isn't even sanctioned, right, by our our own self-censorship, which has to do, of course, with our sense of whether we think right, like whether we understand things, or, what's available to us. We don't want to be, I don't know, I guess I don't have any strong desire to be like a bad person. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not trying.
I don't have a strong desire to be liked.
I don't have a strong desire to be liked.
I do not.
I don't. No, I guess I don't. Clearly, I'm not doing anything to help myself.
I don't have a strong desire to be liked. Could care less.
I don't care. But I want to be loved, of course, by some people. But no, I don't worry too much about people liking me. And to a certain degree, I do think that courting a certain kind of critical disaster by being interested in trap music has, is about holding off, the available scenarios, right? The available critical scenarios, the available affects, and not affects, I hate that word, the available, physical responses to the things that are in the world. And it was, in fact, that inexplicable feeling of excitement that I was interested in, and that I wanted, and that I saw in my own intimate life, right? Like my interior life, where, you can, to a certain degree, you courting disaster a little bit every time you love somebody.
Right. Yeah.
And all kinds of love, right? And it's not, whether it's for your lover or your children or your parents or your friends.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's really hard to talk about that possible disaster. But I mean, you do it. You do it. You have done it.
I'm trying to think of what you're saying and what it reminds me of. Is like, I remember being in family court. And as a child, my two fears, which I tell my daughter as a teenager, was to go to jail or to go into the army. Like, that was like, if that happened in my life would be over. So to go into a family courthouse, which is particularly, many of the guards are people of color. Yeah. And many of the judges are people of color. Yeah. In kind of Brooklyn family court. But the level of like, okay, it's safe in here because they got a lot of security, a lot of guards, and at the same time feeling very unsafe. Right. This dichotomy of feeling like, okay, I just need to be really in control. I can't show any anger. I have to be very measured. But then my lawyer saying, like, well, you're being too measured.
freaking cold.
And I'm just like, yeah, but the place is freaking me out.
Yeah.
I could be, it was, I felt like it was this kind of silencing or aware, like anything could happen in any place, any moment. But also that anything could happen to me in that environment because I just fear the criminal justice system, period.
Oh my God.
So there is this thing and that's the thing that I was saying of kind of, so how does one perform? Meaning one's exterior self in those situations when you're talking about the interiority of one's life.
Yeah.
And so the thing also like that you bring up about trap music is it's also a reflection, of the reality of the violence of the world that we live in as well, in a way.
And its value, the ways in which it can be bought and sold.
Yeah.
I mean, the family court, obviously I have my own experiences, but I mean.
But I meant like specific places that I felt out of body, that I felt,
Well,
I definitely like, I don't feel safe and I don't feel like this, any of this could just go wrong any minute. Where I felt like I should feel differently. If I were white, I'd have more confidence,
I everything I've done for the last 6 years has been to avoid that scenario.
Right. Yeah.
And so in my private life, right, like everything I've done has been to avoid being in that place because I don't feel that is the place where I feel most unsafe.
Yes.
So and where I think that everything that I've done in my life will be reduced to ashes if I can't protect myself in that environment, which I can't. And yeah, that the sense that the powerlessness that one can experience, even right as you are, right, like an exceptional and like by all accounts incredibly successful Black woman in this country.
But I feel like whatever success is the protection of my interior life. That to me is my success. If I can continue to protect and have that for myself and that autonomy, then that is success. And whatever flows from that. But that seems to have been the, whether it's dealings within the art world or in my personal life or as a younger artist and negotiating writers and like, you have a project, other people like, oh, they suggest writers, some I don't know, okay, let me be open, and then realize, okay,
no,
gotta kill that. Not on my time, not under my, auspices, you can write anything you want publicly, but I'm not gonna do that. So I just feel that kind of level of autonomy and protection has to be fought for. Like no one is going, oh, here's a silver platter. What are you thinking today? Oh, nobody's going to do that. Or no one is going to set up any boundaries that prevent erosion of one's interior. So I've always felt, and even with my daughter, that like, that's what you have. That is yours. But it is hard won in this culture that we live in.
Yeah.
And so therefore, like even in thinking critically and kind of all these different landscapes of where autonomy and interiority are at risk, is that, I think people love conformity.
Yes. Yeah.
And it is upsetting and discerning to see someone who is not willing to go the route of conformity. And I feel that that's on many different levels of our lives that occurs. And that's because they don't understand. They haven't kind of achieved their own freedom in their own thinking. And so we can apply that to sexuality, we can apply that to gender, we can apply that to identities of all sorts. It's because people aren't, people don't understand themselves.
Can I ask you, like, do you have multi-generational friendships? Like, are there folks who what's your situation there?
From, well, my daughter's age.
Right.
And then all my friends in between. I would say, who am I friends with that's, I don't really, like my mother and my father are dead for many years now. I have some family left. They're in their early 70s, late 70s, early 80s. But not so much kind of relationships with people older than me.
Not a lot.
I have over the course of my life, but
Mhm.
not at this moment so much.
Well, the older folks, they move on, right? But I guess I asked because the sense that one has achieved a certain kind of freedom or feels oneself to be free and doesn't have to achieve it is I wonder about that as a temporal problem to like how we can think about the ways in which one thinks of themselves as conforming or non-conforming. I'm out here visiting my mother. I've been with my mother more than I usually am.
Yeah.
And and so we have achieved, I think, a kind of nice back and forth.
And generously understood boundary rapport.
We have a rapport. Which often involves questions of conforming and not conforming, right? Like, like I have to constantly push back. Mom will be like, oh, so-and-so's husband. And I'll be like, they ain't married. They never were married, or like,
Right.
But it's just like a joke almost between us.
Yeah.
But I do think this, I love that this book came out of my engagements with teaching, in a way. Like I started writing it because I was super interested in what these really, really young poets were doing with feeling. And I was like, I think that I can work with this as a way of thinking. I have always been, to a certain degree, like I'm not a so-called conceptual writer, right? But they just seemed really close, right? Really close and really careful with a certain kind of staying in the difficulty kind of thing. And I was really, really excited by it. And I guess, I do think of these ways of being in oneself and not as bounded by certain kinds of temporal possibilities or something like that. And I have recently developed some friendships, because I'm at an age where like there are in fact people who are still working, who are 30 years older than I am, and they seem like they're like they live in a different world in their minds, you know what I mean? And they seem so much, obviously some of this is from having worked some shit out, just having worked some shit, done this for a long time. But also, the constraints are different. The constraints are so very different, in where and what they had to do in order to get free is so very different. What you had to do in terms of what it differs very much from what I
didn't have to kill nobody.
Although, as I have mentioned to you once or twice, I have felt like I've had to kill somebody. But I don't know. I mean, and the contemporary, the struggle. My birthday our birthday.
Our birthday. Yes. We share the same birthday.
Yes, our birthdays are the same day. But the contemporary like thing, I'm turning 50, many of my friends are turning 50 this year, last year, next year. And so this, this kind of moment, like we are an aggressive bunch. Like it feels like me that like we're just fighting all the time, not each other.
Right.
Yeah, it feels like there's a kind of combativeness in this moment of, folks who are in my kind of generational zone,
Huh.
which does feel like it has to do with this post-civil rights kind of moment, coming of age in this moment where there was not a feeling of Black solidarity around a kind of like given goal or something like that. I was thinking about Greg Tate.
Yeah.
In this, who I feel like I learned like almost everything about writing about music from.
Yes.
Um,
and writing about art.
Writing about art. I was like, I don't understand. How do you get to be this person? But I understand now a little bit more about it, but I feel bereft a little bit.
Say more.
I feel like there is a difficulty in finding compatriots, and part of it is the sort of the risk and reward system in the art worlds, where there is a kind, maybe there's more competition. Not that I feel competitive, but I think that there is a kind of, like, I really don't feel competitive, and maybe that's a problem.
But you mean in conversation with people or the way that they manage their careers?
I think that the the systems kind of encourage a kind of competition that discourages a sense of shared goals. Maybe the sort of like disappearance of what Fred Moten sometimes talks about as like anti-segregation or desegregation as a shared goal has really. I was reading Nelson George's R&B book, the 1980 book on R&B, like last month, and I was like, it really resonated for me that this sort of declaration that, the loss of a truly Black world, after in the sort of post-Black world, this post-Black world, does things to us, and part of what I think I'm trying to think about as a professional writer and as a teacher is how to kind of reconstitute those bonds, and I don't think this book is outside of that, partly because it details a profound, intellectual and sexual relationship with another artist who is also Black, like thinking about what Black intimacy is. It's got many layers, and I do think, my inside layer. I'm looking over here because I see my mother texting me. I'm like, she has my son, so I'm like, what are they doing?
No, look at it again, make sure everything is good. No. I mean, what's interesting is that this is a complex conversation to me. And in talking about ideas and talking about kind of imagination and where the work comes from and how what the work is, like inside the work, so to speak. So I think also, like you're saying, Greg Tate, I also think at the time, like in the 80s, there was, in terms of as a milieu of artists and writers and filmmakers, we can make this shit up. Let's just get started. And I would think, in talking about Linda Good Bryant and Just Above Midtown, kind of 80s and 90s, that I was exposed to a Black art world that didn't give a fuck.
Mm,
and the artists in it,
mm.
very comfortable with this idea of rest. Like there wasn't this idea that we now have about success,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And so wherever one was spending one's time in this kind of intensity
Mhm.
meant that your commitment to that really had nothing to do with anyone liking it or understanding it, because clearly there wasn't going to be a reception outside of this milieu of people going, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Cause, and having the words and the language and the understanding of what's being done, I very much felt a part of a generation, I could say, that we were just like, oh, they're not going to get it and it doesn't matter. Let's just proceed.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think because I'm not saying there weren't any institutions, but certainly in trying to take things conceptually or intellectually into other arenas and kind of creating, as we were saying before, a different kind of language, a different approach, a different lens, then that means you have to not care.
Mm.
And not care about the rewards. Like, oh, I'm not getting rewarded for what I do. And so even in relationship to my own career in that respect, like getting out of graduate school, no one knew in graduate school how to talk to me about my work. Even in defending for my, MFA, there was silence. Even to the point I was a little annoyed. I was like, oh, if these motherfuckers are being silent,
They
they are
need to
not
say
going to give me
something.
my degree after I've spent an extra year because I like being on the beach. After an extra year, they ain't going to give me my shit. Like I was like getting a little bit tight because I was like, okay, like, oh, you're going to fail me and not say anything. And in fact, no, I got,
Yeah.
oh no, you get your degree. That was great. Silence.
Who was on
So
your committee? Can you say?
no, can I remember?
Yeah. I know David Anton was on that faculty at that time.
David Anton was in the room, maybe not David Anton, Eleanor Anton,
Eleanor
Bill
Anton.
Steinmetz, somebody Lonadier.
Mm.
I mean, I studied with all these people, and it was a very kind of strange dance because in a way I didn't have a language until like I was almost done for what I was doing. Like I had to work out what I was doing, but I didn't really have any kind of engagement where I could talk even with my fellow students about what I was doing, because anytime within kind of seminar situations, if we were asked to kind of collaborate as a class in a seminar, my fellow either West Coast or Midwestern white fellow graduate students would find issue with my material because it was Black, meaning like, oh, but if we include that, God, that means it's Black. That means the director's Black, or it means that the project is Black. So I was a bit antisocial. I was like, I ain't got time for this. Because I was in New York seeing things like David Hammond's or Bill T. Jones.
You're like,
or
this
going up to Harlem.
happened.
I was like, you don't even know what's in the world. I was like, please, I ain't, whatever, fail me. I'm not coming back to this class.
I'm going back to New York anyway.
Exactly. I'm on a plane any goddamn way next weekend. So yes, I just think that, but some of that experience taught me to protect my interiority, that I didn't need, that it would be okay that I have to figure out the words, or it'd be okay that I have this thing and it's like, okay, and this is how tracking the way my mind works is more important than looking for the approval.
Right.
But I think within academia, that's, it is all about the approval or the accomplishment, or you need to do this and you need to do like, and that to be risk adverse.
It is adverse, it's risk aversity creating, I think. Yeah. Well, I mean, this helps me a lot to kind of think about what I'm trying to understand or know about the different ways that, folks perceive their development as artists and writers and thinkers, because yeah, I do often wish for a different time, where people didn't give a fuck, right? Where yeah, I do wish for that time, because it's not now.
Right.
And I do think that, I mean, I feel lucky to a certain degree to be working in a non-paying art where you don't have to give a fuck about poetry to a certain degree, right? Like, I suppose there's a certain amount of reward that you might anticipate for doing some very conformist work, but I don't think the poetry that I came to know is the thing I wanted to do, the thing I had to do. There was definitely no money in that, right? So, which is why I ended up getting a PhD in the first place, because I didn't know how else I was going to support myself, and I was very committed to supporting myself. So, in a way it does for you, because it's like, ain't nobody reading these books anyway. Ain't nobody reading these
I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
I comfort myself a little bit with that notion that the audience is small, and that also,
I don't think the audience is as small as you think it is.
that may be true.
Yeah.
But I guess part of it also is that the audience of people with whom I might want to engage formally, to have a conversation about form, to have a conversation about the practice of poetry, is fairly small. And because I'm kind of more interested in that conversation than I am about how many people read the books or something like that, it's I can do stuff, whatever I want, kind of. And in a way, even just the book being on Duke, which, okay, thanks, Duke. Love y'all. It's still, in a way, I do believe that the work belongs in a handmade environment. I still believe that. And I know that it's antique to believe that about poetry. I still think of it in a way as a thing that's passed from hand to hand. Your poem, oh my God, your beautiful poem. Do you have other poems that you wish others to see, other than the one that was in the New Yorker 2020?
Oh, I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I know you're not like out here.
I was like, what are you talking about? I can do many things,
yes,
not everything, but many things well, and occasionally, but like writing is hard, and it requires me, it does require me to step away from everything. Like, I can't do visual art and write at the same time. It requires a certain kind of occupation of my mind and thinking about words, and like you were saying, or that's in the book of, you think of one word, but it means another thing, but it reminds you of another thing. That kind of alliteration like fills my head, and in a way is a different kind of practice than the other stuff. But I think the pandemic, I mean, and I've done writing over the course of my life, or I would not say I'm a writer at all, but the pandemic allowed me this quiet that I could just sit and write for days on days, which was what was coming out of me was kind of intense, really beautiful. But like, I realized, oh, there's this whole other world of me that exists that I should give more attention to. But it is a completely different way. It's a different part of my brain, a different way an approach. But thank you for saying that.
Oh, can I read this part? Sometimes ghostly, sometimes not. A long time ago in passing, I got to nod and give a smile to my twin in Mauritania. I got a smile and a nod back.
Mhm. Yeah. The like 19-year-old me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Could you just, I mean, whatever you want to say about your current practice, your current painting practice, or how would you call it?
Say that again. I'm
What
sorry.
would-
I was like, oh, I was looking like what are the notes? I'm sorry.
I would say, what, if you had to like say something about your current practice, what your, I don't know whether you want to, I mean, it's a multimedia, many layered practice.
Mm.
But what do you want to say? I'm looking right now at this it's incredible. It's this painting which is called Zenith,
Mhm.
which also has stacks under it. So it has some
Stacked on stones. Yeah.
um I don't know. I just don't have anything. I don't have a question or a formulation. Maybe can you just say something? Because I would just like to end with hearing you talk.
No, we're gonna end with you, but okay. I'll end with a question to you. What do I want to say? To have been able to make work during a pandemic, right? And for me to not lose insight or into myself, or into my own world, to not lose that connection. I really came to appreciate did I put this? The rigor in which I work. So I guess for the first 6 months of the pandemic, I was in California with my daughter and her friends and taking care of them. So kind of being a house mother to like everybody under the age of 24.
Yeah.
Which by the time I left California and came back to New York in September, like I just was like, I need a rest. Because it was intense. And respite means like time to myself, of not like, oh my God, I can't tell someone crying or someone laughing, like, in our household, and making sure that they were emotionally and physically safe and that we were all safe.
Yeah.
I went back into my studio in New York, and I had all this work. Like I had a show that right before the pandemic, that I completed right before the pandemic started, for Hong Kong. And that work was shipped out by that time that show had happened. But I work in such a way that I work past the demand of the show, like, in terms of scale and the scope. I'm kind of just working on a bunch of different things, and then there's kind of selections that I can then thus make as it comes time to ship. And so there's always work in the studio. So there were always also these panels and work that I hadn't completed. And I went back in and I was like, it was very interesting, because really a year had passed or so. And what I thought was interesting wasn't that interesting anymore. And then what I thought when I made it was like, oh, let's just do this to see how it looked. Was like, oh my God, that's amazing. So I was kind of confronted with myself in a way, or my own thought processes, and had to retool, rethink certain things. Some things were like, okay, that's a great direction. But at the time, didn't think much of it.
Yeah.
And so there, even with myself, or kind of the way that I worked, there was this like, oh, you can make some choices here. And I was surprised by the choices that I made, and it made the work even stronger and more interesting. It didn't, perhaps, like I didn't have a whole language for it, which was very funny. By the time for the show in LA, when I was to do press and all that, I was like, I really have nothing. It's like, this is all of me. That's it. I don't have any more right now. I have no words. I can just talk about descriptions. But it was an interesting time of literally not having much for me to say about the show, other than like, okay, here it is. God, please, haven't I done enough? And for me, kind of a lot of my career being, what's the word that I want? Very extroverted in talking about my work, and very much composed about what it is I think about it, how I think about it, how all of that, of not stepping up and doing that was a big deal for me. And in a good way, I was like, no, you don't need to, like, just, you've done the work and you can think about it. You can take your time and you can think about what you've done, even though you're doing it very publicly. That's okay. It's okay to not have all the answers. So that's kind of a gift, I think, to not have all the answers and to be comfortable with that. But that said, you have to give me a moment. You have to give me a moment to ask you. Oh, so this is what, like, when I, like, in going back and I was highlighting different passages, but I want to see how I can read this. That I have given up total privacy in writing about the real conditions of my life. It is some kind of shock to be of the order and also be talking about oneself. And I think, as I was saying before, in terms of interior, one has to give oneself permission to do that. But also that's a kind of inalienable right, that one has the right to do so. But that it's also in witnessing one's own life by examination, by revealing things. So can you just, if we can end on that, but can you speak to?
I can try. I guess we briefly joked about the fact that I was like, what is it with Black women's heads? And we laughed, but in a way, so witnessing oneself, that's like a really complicated way of putting it, right? And like being of the order and also talk, it's like, there's a kind of like swivel or something that's involved. It is impossible, right? To be completely outside yourself,
right,
and take a kind of forest view of what is happening to you and in the world, right? And I do have an impulse to do that. I do feel that's the philosophical impulse, that's the sort of political theoretical impulse that was the first impulse I had as a thinker, to be like, what are the sort of like systemic constraints or circumstances that are in place that cause us to think and do the things that we do? And then and also to examine the sensitivities to those systems, right? And reactivity. This is why like Foucault has been important to me. And and it's asking a lot inside your body, I think, to sort of like be alert in this way, to kind of to be trying. And it can also put the brakes on thinking, in my experience. It can really grind you to a halt. Like if you try too hard to like do it all at once, like to kind of like be like, oh, you can literally stop yourself in your tracks, because it's like, I can't use any goddamn words. None of them make any sense. I can't, you know what I mean? Like, I've rendered myself speechless at this point. You realize how fraught every fucking thing is. And yet that's kind of the place that I'm interested in working from, where there has to be some type of engagement with knowledge, big scale, like knowledge. And and that interplay between what's happening to me, which is the only way I can know knowledge anyway, right? And what's happening in terms of what we understand it to be. I think that's what defines the experimental,
But isn't it all also the willingness to turn over the cart?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The willing to make a mess of it all.
Yep.
The willingness to observe what's broken and not pretend as though it is not. I think that's, a lot of what kind of, I think how do you bring that in text form to make people aware of where language does not work, or that the whole system of things or those encounters have to be turned on their side or turned upside down. And I think the theoretical, yes, can aptly describe the systems and the hierarchy and its impact. But like for the course of people's normal day-to-day lives, where the insidiousness of language and behaviors that are part of that system, how do you get them to, because you feel it first in one's body, you feel it first as an incursion, you feel it first because it doesn't make sense. And I think that is the only, not the only, but one of the most important ways or lenses to get people to realize stuff. Because I think I too enjoy theory, but like on a certain level, how can I put it? It's valuable in the sense like, yeah, and that's some capitalist bullshit.
Yeah, you really have to, yes. And
it is necessary to have that framework. At the other side, though, when it becomes these kind of interactions with people or an interiority, it helps you get out of it, but it doesn't still make it abrasive and kind of disarming, or the encounters.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I talk about Foucault, but I don't think, I'm not a philosopher and I don't have any training in philosophy. It's like, what interests me about Foucault is a writer. So, so, it's the impulse. It's the impulse that interests me in Foucault, to be in multiple places at once while doing the work. I don't know how anybody gets to be that person. I wasn't, he was dead before I was doing anything much. But it's the looking both ways at one time. It's, it's being able to kind of not give a fuck, right? And also to be willing. I remember reading the Foucault, one of the biographies of Foucault, where I can't remember, the phrase "diseases of love" is one that I took away. Maybe it was the Edmund White, I can't recall. But that phrase has stayed with me for a long time. And it was the sense that the philosophical work that was being done was grounded in an understanding of the body at risk, and
the body being under controls,
right? And the ways in which you were going to or not choose to inhabit, right? All of those possibilities. We should probably stop.
All
for
right.
everyone's sake.
Well, I think, full conversations, and also I've had enough of kind of structured Zoom conversations. So I love that our conversation could kind of ebb and flow and be broad and very specific. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you. So thank you.
Oh, Lorna, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much it means that you took the time. I'm serious.
Thank you for the invitation. Amazing. So call me now. Talk back, right? Okay, FaceTime.
I'll call you. Yeah.